Very happy to introduce Professor Stephan Lewandowsky. Dr. Lewandowsky is the chair in cognitive psychology at University of Bristol. His research interests include people's responses to misinformation, why people reject well-established scientific facts. He's received many awards from many countries on many continents. So well done, good job on that. And obviously published just tons and tons of articles. So it made a huge impact on the field. So we are very happy that he's been part of the Honesty Project, and very happy to hear his talk on when liars are considered honest, understanding different logics of political honesty. So,
Thank you. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is a conundrum that I've been worrying about for probably about 6 years. And I'm not the only one to worry about this conundrum. These people are also involved. I kind of harangued them into doing the work for this project, in particular Fabio, who is the real hero of this, and Jana, and everybody else on that list, because they all did an incredible job dealing with this conundrum. So what's the conundrum? Well, it's this. On the one hand, during his presidency, Donald Trump made over 30,000 false or misleading claims. Now, you can give or take a few, I don't want to debate the exact number, but it's very clear that there was a lot of falsehood, or at least misleading statements emanating from the White House. And at the same time, throughout the presidency, among Republicans, about 3/4, again, it fluctuates a little between different polls, but roughly 3/4 of Republicans considered Trump to be honest. And that is something that I find strange and worthy of explanation, because how can that be? And now this isn't just Donald Trump. You can probably look at other politicians around the world who have a similar record of making a lot of false statements, and who did so without suffering a penalty in terms of polls or losing elections. Now, there's a lot of different ways of looking at this, and the way that my collaborators and I are looking at this is through the lens of trying to understand what people consider to be truth and what they consider to be honesty. And what I mean by that is not a debate about specific instances of falsehoods or lies, or whether something is accurate or inaccurate. What I'm talking about here is the sort of understanding of what it means to be honest or truthful. Now, I wrote a chapter a couple of years ago in which I differentiated between two types of ontologies of truth, the nature of truth as it is understood. On the one hand, within a populist logic, where honesty and truth is something that relies on authenticity. What is key to honesty on this assumption is that it feels right. Intuition and feelings are relevant. Sincerity is relevant. Authenticity is relevant. And we call that belief speaking. And in a nutshell, what it means is that if I honestly tell you how I feel, then I'm being honest as a politician. Okay, so if I say the earth is flat, come on, and I give the appearance of believing that, then I'm honest in this belief-speaking sense. Now, opposing that is another notion of truth and honesty, which relies on evidence and which is concerned about truth-telling, about actually being right about the world. So on this notion of truth, it matters whether the earth is round or flat. And if you say it's flat, it doesn't matter how sincere you are about it. You're still, in a sense, being, dishonest, because you're you're telling me something that's false. And it's easy to know it's false. So, therefore, that would not be accepted as honest. Now, the background to this is, when I say here truth and honesty in an idealized democracy, the background to this is that in political theory there is a line of argument that suggests that democracy can't operate without a common knowledge base that everybody agrees to. If you can't agree on the shared knowledge base, then you can't even figure out what you're disagreeing about. You cannot have a political debate. And earlier today, Marie was making a similar point. She called it bullshit, not a populist conception of truth, but the two are very related. She said, well, there's no point in even having a debate because, it is just all nonsense that is being sprouted without regard to the truth. So that was the starting point for our investigation. Now I got to tell you a bit more about how this is sort of all coordinated and how it hangs together and how it overlaps with other theoretical views. So we think of belief speaking and fact speaking as endpoints of a continuum. They're not mutually exclusive. Quite on the contrary, they can go together. And in fact, in another model of honesty published by Cooper et al., which actually is the reason we applied for the funding, because it was part of the call for proposals. And I thought, wow, that's similar. They very explicitly say these two components overlap. They also have a third component, which we looked at, considered, tried to measure, and then discarded because it was not identifiable. So I'm skipping over that now. Now, also importantly, any democratic discourse involves, a passionate contestation of ideas and beliefs and proposals. So clearly it also involves belief speaking. It is not the case that you can't have a democracy just because politicians engage in belief speaking. No, we're not saying that. But what we are saying is that if all you have left is belief speaking, then you have a problem. So, for example, if somebody goes on national TV, as this individual did, and says, oh, truth isn't truth, what he meant by that is, well, we can say what we want, and if we consider it to be true, then, that's it. He didn't quite explicitly say that, but that's, from the context, very clear. That's what he meant. That is problematic, right? So is this other thing here. These two individuals are British personalities, right-wing extremists. This one, said that a fact is an antiquated expression. There's no such thing as a fact anymore. One man's fact is another man's lie. It's all this sort of, this dismissal of the notion that it could even be possible that things actually are in reality one way and not the other. The earth is round, it's not flat. And the possibility of agreeing on that is being dismissed. That is a problem, I find. So, that's the background. And of course, as I said before already, here's a specific reference. This is problematic because you must have some common knowledge that people agree on in a democracy, if nothing else. That there is an election and that people should be allowed to vote and that it was done fairly. And if you undermine that common knowledge, then things become very problematic indeed. So, our project then was about the following. We did 4 things, 4 work packages or stages. The first stage was dedicated to identifying these different conceptions of honesty in political speech and examine, first of all, whether they exist, whether they're identifiable, and then how they relate to the spread of misinformation. The second stage, predicated on the first one being successful, was to link this to historical events in American history. We chose American history, we chose American presidents because, well, they're easily identifiable, and they also have this habit of engaging in scandals or becoming embroiled in scandals every so often that involves a lot of dishonesty, arguably. We then wanted to connect political speech to public attitudes. And finally, we wanted to see to what extent major indicators of the health of a society are related to the speech by politicians and how that relates to these two conceptions of truth. So let me walk you through all four stages. Some of this has been published, other stuff is in the pipeline. So I'll give you a thumbnail sketch of what we did. This is a paper in Press with Nature Human Behavior, where we looked at the tweets of all members of Congress during that time period. That was 1.6 million tweets. We then assigned to each tweet a score on how much it captured belief speaking versus fact speaking, and I'll explain in a moment how we did that. We also looked at belief speaking and fact speaking in the news articles that were being shared by those politicians in the tweets. So we looked at the target of the link that they were sharing with the public, and we assessed the accuracy of tweets based on the NewsGuard score of the news articles being shared. NewsGuard is it's close to being a gold standard of accuracy of a domain. They don't do fact checking, but they do a very thorough analysis based on journalistic criteria, based on a point system of individual news domains. And they use criteria such as, do they have an editor? Can you complain if something is false? Do they identify opinion and differentiate it from ads? Basic journalistic stuff. So it is pretty objective, and it's kind of hard to debate this and dismiss it. That won't stop people, but in reality, it's pretty good. Now, how did we identify belief speaking and fact speaking? Well, we did it by creating two dictionaries that we felt captured this distinction. The dictionaries were validated extensively through experimentation with humans, whom we asked for their opinion, and also by analyzing the coverage of the New York Times. And so, for example, we found that the science section contains more fact speaking than the opinion pages. And the opinion pages contain more belief speaking than fact speaking. Okay, so, we took that together with lots of other stuff to suggest that we can identify these two conceptions of truth. And just to illustrate, here are some words from these congressional tweets that are plotted on this graph according to how much they identify belief speaking at the top versus fact speaking at the bottom, and the extent to which they identify a Republican tweet as opposed to a Democratic tweet. Okay? So Democrats on the right, Republicans on the left, and what I'm plotting are the words that are identifying the location in this space of, on the one hand, ideology, on the other hand, the type of truth. And it's kind of interesting. What you can see is that when Republicans are engaging in belief speaking, they talk about Democrats, freedom, something is radical, Democrats, okay? Democrats, by contrast, talk about Republicans when they're engaging in belief speaking. They're the opponent. But then they talk about democracy equal. Something is equal. Voting is important to them. Voter. So that gives you a sense of what this is about. When Republicans are concerned with fact speaking, they talk about business, security, technology. Democrats, by contrast, are talking about the community, public health, investment. You sort of get the picture. And just by way of specific examples, this is one Republican high belief-speaking tweet, and here is a Democrat high fact-speaking tweet, both dealing with the impeachment of Donald Trump. And I think you sort of get the flavor of the difference between those two things. Now, crucially, so far, I haven't said anything about misinformation or whether something is true or false. With those two tweets, I'm making no claim that one is more accurate than the other. All we've done so far is to characterize the type of language that politicians are engaging in and how it reflects their understanding of truth. Now, if you now take that and connect it to the quality of information being shared, then you get a pattern that speaks to the presence of misinformation. What I'm showing you now are those congressional tweets on the left, plotted as a function of belief speaking, on the right as a function of fact speaking, and on the ordinate, on the y-axis, I'm plotting the quality of the domain being shared in a tweet according to NewsGuard. Now, let's start with fact speaking, because that's easiest. Basically, it means that the more fact speaking a tweet contains, the better the quality of the information being shared. And that's true for both parties. Republicans in red, Democrats in blue. Now, Democrats are above the Republicans. That is pervasive. There's no, we published a separate paper on that. That is unequivocally the case. But the difference is diminished the more both parties engage in fact speaking. Belief speaking, on the other hand, shows a clear divergence. For Democrats, it makes hardly any difference. For Republicans, the more they engage in belief speaking, the more likely they are to share lower quality information. And if we now take this one step further, and we look at the articles that they're pointing to that are being shared, and we analyze those articles, not the tweets, then it becomes even more striking. That is, that the more Republicans share articles that engage in belief speaking, the lower the quality of that article. And again, for fact speaking, that is not the case. So there's a clear differentiation between the implications of belief speaking and fact speaking. And the way we characterize this is to say that belief speaking is a gateway to misinformation. Now, that doesn't mean any expression of belief is dishonest or inaccurate. We're not saying that. We're saying that belief speaking seemingly offers an avenue towards sharing of misinformation, which in this case was seemingly exploited by Republicans, but not by Democrats. And interestingly, regardless of party, fact speaking is associated with increasing accuracy of the content being shared. So, and both parties can engage in that if they choose to do so. All right, that was the first stage. The second stage now was to take these conceptions of honesty and to link it to historical events during the last 30 or 40, 50 years. Now, Twitter doesn't go back that far. So what we looked at for the remaining stages that I want to talk about is not Twitter, but congressional records. So we looked at the congressional records speeches on both houses of Congress, speeches on the floor. And we classified them, measured them in the same way as we did before, using our dictionaries. Now, for stage 2, where we're interested in historical events, we only looked at a few years before and after key events, which I'll explain in a moment, and we only looked at those speeches that pertain to the event in question, such as Watergate, etc. I'll explain that in a moment. For the last 2 stages, however, we looked at whatever this is, 40 years of congressional records in their entirety, because we're no longer concerned about key events. Now, in both cases, what we're basically trying to do statistically is to relate the linguistics, the speech in Congress, to the events we're interested in. So in the first stage, we're looking at triggers, historical events, and we ask, we wonder what happens to speech in Congress. In stages 3 and 4, we look at whether events in Congress over 40 years have some connection with important public attitude indicators, or indeed indicators of society as a whole. So, here we go, stage 2, what do we look at? These are our events: Watergate, Iran-Contra, Lewinsky, weapons of mass destruction. So it's about, every 10 years something happens that's kind of interesting, involving presidents, and it's not only Republicans. Lewinsky was Bill Clinton, and in all cases, there's a lot of at least conjecture, if not clear evidence, that the president was less than honest. Okay, I think, to put it mildly, that's true for all of them. I don't want to get into specific accusations, but it's pretty clear there was something dodgy going on. And this is what we find. So, what we're looking at is belief speaking in red, fact speaking in orange, in Congress, in speeches that are related to the event in question. So in each panel we have a different scandal: Watergate, Iran-Contra, Lewinsky, weapons of mass destruction. And we're looking at what Congress people are saying in Congress with reference to those events. We're only looking at speeches for those events. Now, the effects are very subtle, a lot more subtle than we had hoped, to be honest. But there is a generality that you can pick up with a squint, at least, but also statistically, which is that after the event, sometime after the event in question, there is an increase of fact speaking in Congress. That is, politicians tend to invoke more fact speaking than belief speaking. However, at the beginning of all these periods, belief speaking tends to predominate. Now, when I say predominate, again, it's a small effect, but it is leaning in that direction. Again, this isn't a terribly clear pattern. I wish I could say, oh, look at this, it's wonderful. No, it's not, but, we spent quite a bit of time on this, and we have some moderate degree of confidence that that is what we can conclude. Now, it also makes a lot of sense, if you think about it, because early on, when you don't know that Richard Nixon isn't a crook, as he famously said, well, then you might engage in belief speaking either way. If you like him, you'll say, oh, I believe he's innocent. If you don't like him, you say, yeah, I believe he's a crook. And it's only when the evidence emerges that you then have to deal with the reality and you switch to belief speaking. So that would be one way of explaining these data. But I'm not going to dwell on it too much because the remaining stuff is much more interesting, and I think the effects are clearer than this. But we may go back to these historical events because it would be really cool to show how presidential dishonesty is affecting discourse in politics in the United States. I'm not claiming that we've got it pinned down, but there's a signal there somewhere. Now, stage 3, connecting political speech to public attitudes. What do we mean by public attitudes? Well, we examined pre-existing survey data, a number of different things, candidates were considered. There were problems with a lot of them, basically all of them. The one that was least problematic is this one, which is something called monitoring the future. And that has been administered to US high school seniors, 12th graders, every April since 1976. And the questions have remained invariant, okay? And some of these questions are relevant to what we're interested in, namely perceptions of politicians' trust in politics. Now, these are 17-year-olds, right? So this isn't a representative sample of the American population because we don't have it. But in terms of getting a historical pattern, I think it is still quite interesting. And just to illustrate, here are some of the items, and they're identified by which dimension they load on in a principal components analysis. So the first handful loads on one dimension, and the second handful on the other. And if you then go through it, then the first set of questions is mainly about competence. Would you say the government is pretty much run for a few big interests, or is it run for the benefit of the people? Are they smart people who usually know what they're doing? It's kind of a little bit of competence in there. And the second cluster is more evaluative. How satisfied are you with the way the government is operating? But these are all items that are of considerable interest. And how does that relate to speech in Congress? Well, one way of interpreting the data, our preferred way, despite a p-value that's definitely not too good to be true, right? It is borderline. We think there's evidence that if there is a positive shock of fact speaking, what we mean by that is if fact speaking in Congress increases from year to year relative to belief speaking, then that is followed by a positive response in trust in government. A year later, Fabio?
Yeah, those are basically yearly.
Oh, there it is, of course. Right. Yeah. So, in other words, fact speaking in Congress is leading, 17-year-olds to become more trusting of the government sometime later, which is interesting and perhaps gratifying. It would be very nice to pin this down a bit more with other measures of public attitudes, but as I said, we, for this historical thing for 40 years, it's extremely difficult to get continuous data. The MTF is continuous in the same items, so that's the incredible advantage that they have. And finally, honesty in society. Well, of course, society is big. There's a lot of it. So what do you measure? Well, we measured economic inequality for a number of reasons. First of all, because it's been linked to the emergence of far-right populism. Inequality tends to give rise to that. Inequality has also been linked to polarization, and polarization very often is preventing a common understanding of facts. So for those two reasons, we thought economic inequality might be particularly diagnostic for what is going on. And so what we did was to look at the Gini coefficient from 1976 to 2016. This is from the US Census. that captures inequality in American society overall. And just as before, we're trying to model a relationship between the prevalence of belief speaking or fact speaking in Congress to inequality. And what we find is, again, something interesting, which is that there is a nearly significant relationship between belief speaking and higher inequality as captured by the Gini coefficient. So more fact speaking gives you more trust. More belief speaking gives you higher inequality. Now that's a very subtle effect. So let me show you another graph that doesn't require statistics. That's that. Now, this is a graph that is capturing 140 years of congressional speech dating back to 1880 through 2020. And what we're showing here are three things. Number one, the type of honesty in Congress. Number two, inequality. Number three, polarization. Inequality is orange, polarization is black, and blue is the difference between fact speaking and belief speaking. Now you may notice I put that in quotation marks. And there's a reason for that. Because this was done through our companion project called ProDem Info, an ERC Advanced Grant, that used slightly different dictionaries and a slightly different approach that was related to truth rather than honesty. But the two are sufficiently comparable for me to show you this graph because it's amazing anyway. And what is amazing here is that if you look at this trend, this is 140 years. The blue line, the higher that goes, the more American politicians talk about fact speaking. And the lower it goes, the more they engage in belief speaking. And you can see a very distinct peak up to 1980. I wonder what happened in 1980. Ronald Reagan got elected. And since, but there's a sort of almost a century of increasingly fact-speaking language, and then bang, we have now reversed that, and we are now back to where we were in the Gilded Age in 1880. And now look at inequality, the orange line. It's exactly the opposite. When inequality was high, we don't have the data going back further. It's very difficult to get earlier inequality data because there was no income tax in the United States. And no one had a clue how much money people were making prior to whatever this is, 1900 or 1910. But as inequality declined, fact speaking went up, and as that declined, inequality went back up. And polarization, precisely the same pattern. I didn't say that.
Sorry,
I didn't say that. I think, I think, in retrospect, I mean, by today's standards, Reagan was different. I mean, yeah, he was nothing like what we currently are facing. So this is a pattern that I think is, you don't have to do statistics on this. And we find it absolutely fascinating. We're right now in the middle of pinning this down. Statistically, I just said you don't need statistics. Well, you don't to look at it and know what's going on. Where you do need statistics is to work out the temporal sequence, the lag between these curves. And then you can indulge in the possibility of causal modeling. And you can sort of make claims about what might be going on. And the other thing we're going to do is we're going to relate it to measures of congressional performance. There are, in fact, performance indicators for Congress. And so we haven't had a chance yet to do this, but it would be very interesting to see how well Congress is performing as a function of the type of language people are using. So there we are. We set out to look at two distinct conceptions of honesty. I think we've identified them. pretty solidly. We've identified belief speaking as a gateway to misinformation, also as a precursor to increased inequality. And conversely, when people engage in fact speaking, it increases trust in government, and it also means they're not sharing misinformation. So there is hope. All you got to do now is get politicians to use that language. With that, I thank you for your attention.
Questions? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for this. Just a very quick, I think, clarifier. Can you just give a quick statement of what belief speaking versus fact speaking is? I know you associated them with the populist conception of truth versus, the other version, but I'm trying to get clear, and the reason I'm asking is because the fact I would think is associated with knowledge, and knowledge is just a type of belief.
Yeah, but it's justified true belief.
Sure.
Well, let me go back to my definition. There we go.
Yeah, so this is populist versus...
Yeah, but then look at the bullets the underneath. Belief speaking relies on authenticity. The key aspect to it is that I'm authentically telling you how I feel, and my feelings are relevant. And common sense, everybody knows that immigrants from Mexico, XYZ, whatever, are bad hombres, as Trump suggested, that appeal to common sense, intuition. That's belief speaking. Fact speaking, it cares about truth. Veracity trumps feelings. If you don't like it that the earth is round, well, on a fact speaking conception of truth, that's just too bad. It is round, and we have the evidence. And so it relies on evidence, not feeling. And it is not important for fact speaking whether the person is sincerely expressing their feelings. It is just not an issue. If I tell you the earth is round, it doesn't matter how I feel about it. Okay? Does that help?
So where would you locate knowledge? An assertion of knowledge?
An assertion of knowledge, well, give me an assertion of knowledge, I'll run our model and I'll tell you. But probably fact speaking. Probably fact speaking.
Okay.
Yes. Well, again, this is about the language that is reflective of how people think about truth. That is what we're after. Okay? Do I think that there is such thing as truth based on the state of the world? That that accuracy matters. Am I interested in the world? Well, whenever I give that impression, our dictionary will pick that up. As you can maybe tell from the sample tweets. Okay? I mean, I will work to ensure there's a fair trial and all of the facts are gathered and evaluated. I'll use that information to make a determination, right? To my mind, I mean, you can't get more evidence-based and fact-speaking than that. And it doesn't have to involve knowledge. Mm-hmm. It is just a language that is dedicated to evidence and factuality and veracity. This up here, it's belief speaking. It's kind of saying, this other guy, he's got a boatload of bad intentions and imagination, but, it's saying it in a way that is not appealing to evidence. It is not saying here, Schiff is misrepresenting what was said on January 13th. It is just making these assertions based on belief. And incidentally, the way we identify these as being belief speaking or fact speaking is taking the context of the language into account. This is not just counting words in the tweets. This is converting the words to embeddings based on a pre-trained corpus of 2.2 million words, and we consider the context in all of this. So it's it's a fairly fine-grained representation of similarity. Let's put it that way.
Thank you.
Can I jump off of that question real quickly? One of the things I'm thinking about is how we can misuse labels to make it sound like something's a fact when it's not. So I could say the Earth is spherical, or I could say it is a fact the Earth is flat. I could use it is a fact the Earth is flat and say fact, but be giving something that's not a fact.
Yes.
So how does the model deal with that?
Yes, it doesn't. But it's an empirical question whether that can be done. Now, you're absolutely right. It is in theory possible for me to engage in fact speaking and be entirely misleading. Okay, and in fact, I would argue that climate deniers and anti-vaxxers are giving that pretense of being highly scientific, more scientific than the scientists, because climate change is all models and scientists should measure things and not use models, that type of language. Now, the problem with that is that even though they try, I think they fail quite dramatically, and they never sound scientific if you're actually a scientist. But it's an open question whether we can pick that up with this. And so you're absolutely right. It could be gamed. I've done a project, a side project, got nothing to do with the Honesty Project, where I took the same analysis and I looked at the tweets of British politicians about Northern Ireland, specifically about Northern Ireland. And much to my surprise, the conservative politicians were engaging in more fact-speaking than the Labour counterparts. Now that's very surprising because pretty much everything a conservative politician since Brexit has said about Northern Ireland is false. It's fantasy, incorrect. And, but that's pretty premature. I haven't pinned that down.
So some of what you're capturing is how much people value focusing, in the way they're communicating, focusing on belief type words versus fact type references.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And that's, yes, basically. It's about the language, the use of honesty in political language.
I have a short video clip that you need to put at the beginning of your talk, which is Hassan Minhaj recently interviewed Barack Obama.
Yeah.
And one of the questions was, Trump is emotionally real and factually false, and you are factually real and emotionally unavailable.
Right.
And so my question
And
is,
how did he respond to that?
So Obama did the I get what you're saying. He did the chuckle, right? The cool guy chuckle, and then he said, I totally get what you're saying. It makes sense, but facts are more important than that.
Right.
So here's my question, right?
Yeah.
When something is complicated, or when something requires a lot of previous knowledge, or when a situation doesn't fall within our realm of expertise, human beings rely on their emotional reactions in order to make decisions about what is supposed to come next or what they're supposed to do, right? And in fact, it is a therapeutic sort of intervention to let your emotions guide you to make decisions about what you're doing in your life and to be emotionally authentic and that sort of thing. So I wonder if you've thought about the fact that with something as complex as the Trump impeachment, there's lots of facts, there's lots of emotions, there's lots of timelines, there's lots of complexity there. For somebody who doesn't have the time to read a 97-page indictment, no matter how insane it is, right? To rely on the emotions, there's some logic behind it, right?
Oh, yeah.
We all love to be stoics who rationally consider every piece of evidence, but the truth is the human brain, the emotions came first, right? The emotions tell us danger, the emotions tell us approach, the emotions tell us avoidance. So I wonder how you think about the fact that emotional knowledge is a valid way of understanding the world, particularly with the complexities of politics or the complexities of climate change, where there is this sort of emotional fear that may get connected, right? Because that's Trump's great quality, is activating everyone's emotions and getting them to make decisions based off of the emotional response.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And that's what populism is all about, right? It's an emotion. It's an emotional appeal to people who feel left out, feel left behind, and are resentful, and it gives them somebody to blame by creating this artificial divide between the people and the elite, which of course is always artificial and just constructed by demagogues as they see fit. Oh, absolutely, I'm not disagreeing with you. I mean, that is what makes populism so attractive, because it does offer a shortcut in a complicated world. Yeah, but
I guess I'm wondering what do you recommend? What can be
Okay.
done? How can we
The-
frame truth speaking versus belief speaking
Right.
when belief speaking is so appealing?
well, that's precisely what we're working on right now, is to see whether belief speaking is necessarily more appealing, or whether people find politicians more honest if they appeal to belief rather than if they use fact-speaking language. And Fabio, do you want to say anything to that? Do you know
What
enough?
we're actually trying to do right now is to see whether we can use this kind of information to actually do something useful. Because another part of for example, this analysis focuses on the replies of people to this kind of text, and we can see that people reply in a more affective, polarized way to belief speaking rather than truth seeking. And so we're trying to adopt like perspective-taking experiments. So we kind of put participants in truth-seeking or belief-speaking way of seeing the world. And I mean, the results are still like under analysis, but we can see that usually when people are put in a truth-seeking worldview, they manage to recognize belief-speaking texts, and they lower their kind of perceived honesty towards those kind of texts.
And so the plan is to develop interventions like inoculations, which I've been doing, for many years, to protect people against getting suckered into that language. But those are all small effects, and the real problem, of course, is that for this to be an issue, you have to have leaders who are prepared to engage in demagoguery and who have no scruples. And that is really the core issue. And whatever researchers do isn't going to make a difference to that. Although the moment those demagogues are paying a price at the ballot box, then this is all going to disappear very quickly. Because as Fabio said, if in this other data, which I didn't have time to talk about, but it's fascinating stuff, in these Twitter conversations, the tone of the conversation by the respondents is set by the initial politician, even in the same dyads. So the same politician on different occasions with the same respondent, if the politician flips, so does the respondent. So it is people reply in kind. And so there's a huge, there's the power of leadership there.
Right. And that's a group identity thing too, right? Because the Democrats aren't necessarily using belief language
Well, they do.
more or less than the Republicans. They're just using it on different topics.
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed. And in fact, yes. Yeah, the parties don't differ much in terms of volume of or extent of belief speaking. It's just the consequences differ between them dramatically.
Yeah. Thank you.
So you began with a really perplexing conundrum. How much does increases in belief speaking account for that craziness?
Well, I haven't gone full circle and explained the conundrum entirely. Okay, what I've done is taken one step, which is to say, well, one way in which it could be the case that people think somebody's honest despite lying to them all the time is through this belief-speaking idea and the emphasis on authenticity. Now that I've shown. There's also other data, not from our lab, but by Oliver Hall and colleagues, who showed in an experiment that people are tolerant of lying demagogues if they think that those demagogues are acting on their behalf in a situation where the people feel that the system is corrupt or that they're left out. So in other words, and the title is called the authenticity of the lying demagogue or something. So we also know that people accept belief speaking and furphies from Trump under certain circumstances, but not other circumstances. And that's why the work on inequality, I think, is very important, because it is under conditions of inequality, gross inequality, that you have a lot of people who are susceptible to those lies, and who don't mind being lied to, provided that guy is authentically attacking the elites. So, I don't know. I'm not there yet. We haven't quite closed it, but I think those are the stepping stones on the way to resolving that conundrum.
Other questions for Steve? Okay. Well,
Okay,
very much.
thank you.